I mean, in real time, we see the myth of the European dream being dismantled because there's always this belief in Georgia, in Armenia, that, Europe is like a panacea, right? But there is kind of like a disconnect between this myth and the reality. And I don't just mean now, recently. When we look at, Frau von der Leyen, and we look at, Borrell and Michel and all our favorite, Eurocrats making their remarks and their statements and yelling and screaming and all that. I mean, it's reflective of a crisis. But even before, when we go back to 2009, go back to 2010, look at the Eurozone crisis. Armenians and Georgians have a long-standing history with the Mediterranean world, Greece with Italy, right? So when we see Greece and Italy suffering because of these kind of Eurocratic policies, then maybe it should give you some pause to think.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Pietro, Shakarian and Lasha Kasradze. Both of my colleagues hail from the Southern Caucasus region, Pietro from Armenia and Lasha from Georgia. Both of them are living abroad. Pietro is a historian at the Higher School of Economics in St. Petersburgh, Russia, and Lasha is an international relations analyst working in the US as a liaison officer for Georgia's Sokhumi State University. The three of us want to discuss the geostrategic situation of the Caucasus and the new multipolarity that now even the USA seems to embrace. Pietro, Lasha, welcome back.
Thank you, Pascal.
It's great to be here. Thank you very much, Pascal.
I'm glad to have you both in the same podcast because you have unique insights into your region. And, the Southern Caucasus has seen a lot of developments in the last years. There was this war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the whole situation or ethnic cleansing of Nagorno-Karabakh. And then we've seen on Georgia extreme pressure from the EU and US for regime change and change of national laws and so on. Maybe Pietro first and then Lasha. Do you think the most intense period for the Southern Caucasus is now over, or do you expect more volatility in, like, let's say, 2025, 2026?
I think there is some pressure off because especially when we look at the previous American administration, the Joe Biden administration, there was intense efforts to really use this region against Russia, to open a second front of the Ukraine war in this region. And there were different, ways in which they were trying to achieve that. One would be certainly through, Nagorno-Karabakh or Armenia, Azerbaijan. Now there's this issue with Zangezur, Sunik, the Sunik province of Armenia that Azerbaijan wants to kind of assert a claim to, but also even to kind of use Georgia as a kind of a weapon against Russia to kind of like, activate a new kind of war, a new conflict with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Yeah, I think that at least the pressure is off this region, which is very good news. I can't say though. I mean, unfortunately, in Armenia's case, there's still this Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan who is really just terrible for Armenia. I mean, there's no other way I can describe it. I mean, we'll get into him more, I'm sure, in this conversation, and his geopolitical orientation and his worldview. But he is, I think, a very destabilizing force for the Caucasus, and he's put Armenian security at risk, really also Russian security, Iranian security at risk. He's actually strengthened the hand of Turkey. We talked about Turkey last time on this podcast. So yeah, no, that would be my 2 cents. I mean, I leave Georgia more to Lasha to explain about that.
Yeah,
thank you, Pedro. It's great. Go ahead, Pascal.
Now, what do you think, Lasha? Do you share that assessment?
Yes. I think I'm gonna agree with that. With Pashinyan, yes, I don't understand the adventurism with France and the West, and this is more of the same. I want to ask. But let me just go back to the overall point that Pietro made. I think with the change in the international system, I think you both would agree with me. with this return to multipolarity, I think that sort of eased off pressure regionally in the South Caucasus. I think what happened is that unipolar world, that sort of one-way street, sort of absolutist approach to the South Caucasus has, in relative terms at least, is over. And Georgia is relieving with is relieved basically to not feel under pressure, like Pietro said, because there were not just allegations, but I think at this point we all know that there was an enormous pressure in Georgia to open up the second front. With different methods, I hear, that U.S. Embassy was talking about Georgia using or supplying old Soviet arsenals to Ukraine, leftover from the 2008 war, something along those lines. So, you can if all this is something that U.S. And the collective was pushing for, you can imagine what Georgia was going through. And so, yes, to Petro's point, yeah, the pressure from the collective West has eased. But you know what? More than that, I think the myth has also been broken. The narratives have been shattered. And really, to a large extent, I think the truth has come out of what this entire project had been about. Since I would go back since before 2008, Russia's invasion of Georgia. Sort of this entire narrative propaganda, sort of NATO expansion in the middle of the South Caucasus. So I think we are coming to an end of that.
Is the end of this, or the
I would phrase it as the end of history. What we're seeing is really the end of the dominance of this kind of Fukuyama ideology, of this kind of a deterministic view of history. And
Right.
I think when we look specifically at the Caucasus, Southern Caucasus region, and we look at Armenia and Georgia, I mean, in real time, we see the myth the myth of the European dream being dismantled, because there's always this belief in Georgia, in Armenia, that Europe is like a panacea, right? But there is kind of like a kind of a disconnect between this myth and the reality, because if Armenians and Georgians actually, were following the news out of Europe, and I don't just mean now recently, when we look at, Frau von der Leyen, and we look at, Borrell and Michel and all our favorite, Eurocrats making their remarks and their statements and yelling and screaming and all that. I mean, it's reflective of a crisis. But even before, when we go back to 2009, go back to 2010, look at the Eurozone crisis. Right? When you're looking at such profound crises, now Armenia and Georgia are ancient countries, they're old countries, right? Armenians and Georgians have a long-standing history with the Mediterranean world, with Greece, with Italy, right? So when you see Greece and Italy suffering because of these kind of Eurocratic policies, then maybe it should give you some pause to think, right? But now we're seeing this myth being dismantled in real time. And the people, I can say, of Armenia see that, but I don't know about Pashinyan. And that's a whole other, ball of wax,
but the
so to
thing
speak, to use the
is,
English phrase.
But the thing is, like this crisis and the way that especially Greece was treated by its own club of countries, right? How it was hammered and
Yes.
squeezed out to death, a brain drain of millions of people leaving a sinking ship. That itself was not enough to convince a lot, right? This whole mania of westernization, Europeanization, that carried on, and it seems really only that the second Trump administration now kind of ends it for good. I mean, it was fading out maybe over a time, but is this because in one way there is this danger, isn't it, that we overinterpret what Donald Trump is doing or ushering in. But on the other hand, there's so many structural changes that are happening that are probably irreversible. Can you maybe speak to this? Maybe Pietro first and Lasha.
Well, I think already we're seeing trends even before Trump came in. So, I mean, if you were following the news closely, you already saw some op-eds from Bloomberg, or maybe Wall Street Journal even, or New York Times, where they were already talking about the need for the U.S. to pull back from Europe, right? Already also there was a kind of pushback against the excessive political correctness that had been a signature of the Joe Biden administration in particular. And so you could see that within the establishment, within the deep state, so to speak, when we use these terms, already there were tendencies to kind of, have kind of, I guess you could say, a pullback. And Trump, in many ways, is the instrument to realize it. I mean, he's the ideal person to realize it as the disruptor, as he's often called in the media. So I think there has been kind of a precursor to this. But yeah, I mean, what we're seeing now, the US can only take so much. So much money has been wasted on all these projects to influence societies, as we see with USAID, with regime change, with these catastrophic, atrocious wars from Iraq to Libya to Syria to Ukraine, that, at some point it was going to lead to some, it was going to lead to some tipping point where the U.S. would eventually have to kind of come home or have its come home moment. Maybe not completely, but still we're seeing a movement in that direction.
Lasha.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember, just to sort of broaden this a little, from a personal perspective, when Kosovo happened, and the Serbian bombardment and everything, it was sort of some sort of just to use Pascal's phrase here, psychosis, a collective psychosis. People thought, yes, it is kind of wrong, but not really. So it was that, this is America doing it. How can it be wrong? We are, killing off a bunch of bad guys and dictators out there somewhere. I mean, I remember these times and that sort of social mood, if you will. And yet there was something fundamentally wrong with all that. And it's that something that sort of erupted eventually and came up. And, basically the president today, Trump, actually called it. But be that as it may, yes, just to go back to the region, you know, right now, what Georgia is doing is basically as it always has. It's going back to sort of geopolitics of this whole thing, geopolitical principles, how to survive as a small state. And I think on the foreign policy front, the Georgian dream has done a great job in terms of balancing. And I've always been asking this question. There's still in the literature today, you see, well, the United States still has a chance and it has to save the South Caucasus, or it has to go way back in there and has to. And yet there is no answer. The answer is what we are seeing. My question is, what is the United States' role now left over in the South Caucasus? What if Georgia finds a common way with Moscow and starts, it's a long shot. I always, it's a huge caveat, but what if they start talking about restoration of sovereignty? And this whole idea of South Caucasus sort of coming together as a geopolitical space, as a common geopolitical space, call it strategic independence, call it whatever fancy phrases we want to use. But at the end of the day, we know that the West failed. Georgia has not been industrialized. Armenia is not, exactly, an industrialized country. Azerbaijan has its oil and, and energy and gas and transport sort of assets that both the East and the West want. Great. But at the end of the day, Caucasus sort of remains what it has always been. It's a bridge between the East, West, North, South. And out of these basic principles, you have to sort of reconfigure your own foreign policy. And then the basic question then becomes, what of the West? What about, okay, so let's just give 5% chance to Georgia of joining the European Union because NATO is out of the question. It always has been. Let's just say Putin acquiesces to Georgia's joining the European Union because it doesn't, it's not a security issue, right, per se. How is this going to, so is Georgia going to be some sort of an island of industrialized West in the middle of the South Caucasus, given the bureaucracy that you guys just alluded just a few minutes ago of chaotic bureaucracy, selfish bureaucracy of the European Union, what they did with Greece. Are they going to allow Georgia produce and develop its own industries? Maybe Pascal could sort of could chime in on this. I'm really curious how the collective European sort of economy works in terms of, say, helping a new member become wealthy, right? I don't think so. And this is, there are still lots of questions that are unanswered. To me, most important, obviously, is the security question. And the only way to guarantee Georgia's security is for Georgia to do basically what it's doing right now, both regionally and in its relations with its collective partners, Western partners.
Not only in terms of security, also sovereignty, Lasha. I mean, it's about sovereignty, because when you are balancing, I mean, you're pursuing your own interests. I have to say, I really think Bidzina Ivanishvili is absolutely brilliant. I mean, he's probably the smartest and most pragmatic political leader in the Caucasus today.
Oh, he certainly caught that foreign policy thing very well. Yeah,
absolutely. And originally, actually, when he came to the office, this was in 2012, 2013. Actually, he even cited Serge Sargsyan at the time, because Armenia originally was much more balanced. Before Pashinyan came in, and Ivanishvili said, we should kind of pursue like an Armenia way.
I remember that,
yes. Where we should put our Georgian interests first, right? And when we think about this, when we think about the current, the new, I guess you could say, or renewed multipolar moment, it works very well for Armenia and Georgia if Armenia and Georgia are pursuing purely their national interests, which is to say pro-Georgian interests, pro-Armenian interests, because in a multipolar world, based on the fundamentals of international law and based on the UN Charter. So not an international law that's like the law of the jungle. This is something that works for these countries. And so, especially when we talk about Georgia, when we talk about the issues with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are very painful, these issues of restoration of sovereignty, the best way to resolve these problems, and this is what Bidzina stressed, is through dialogue with Abkhaz, with Ossetians. And as I always say, actually, that for Georgians, I mean, this is something that I think can be done. Because when you look at, like, Abkhazia, so when you look at the first united Georgian state, this was in 1008, right, on Bagrat III of Abkhazia, right? This was the first time Georgia became united. And you see the role of Abkhazia in that. Queen Tamar's husband was Alan. He was Ossetian. So it's not impossible for Abkhaz and Georgians, Ossetians and Georgians to come together.
No, it's not.
But
there is
but it has to be done through dialogue, through peace. This is the only way. This is why when we look at the Karabakh issue and the way Aliyev thinks he can resolve problems through war, through military means, it's never a good solution, especially for our region. The only way is through dialogue and through negotiation. That's the only way that this can come about.
Lasha, do you want to respond? Can I ask another question?
Well, sure. Just to finish off the point. Well, with hard power, I mean, we've achieved nothing. Georgia. We all know. I mean, Georgia has made mistakes in the early '90s. Hard power achieves nothing. In our case, hard power, is extremely important, of course, especially from sort of this realpolitik, realist school. But when you're in a small country, divided country, a poorer state, you have to apply to basic sort of historic geopolitical principles and regional diplomacy. That's the only option, and we see this unfold. We see pressure easing off, not by choice, but by basically. But by having no other choice but to sort of relatively ease off pressure from the collective West onto the South Caucasus because of this sort of multipolar return of the multipolar system. But not just because the United States is just adventurism, geopolitically speaking, has got no vital national security interests in the region. So that also plays into it. This is very strange when I say this in this country. What do you mean? Ukraine is not in our national security interest. And when I say no, people get frustrated. But I think what's happening is basically the contours of what it has always been are coming back again and becoming visible, the region. And I think Georgia has gotten that balance. And I wonder what the Pashinyan is thinking. I know Pashinyan has also said that, his adventurism, so his hope that, the EU or France with French leadership, they're going to save Armenia. Probably won't pan out. I think he said that.
Yeah, he did, unfortunately.
Alluded to it, right? But Pascal, if you don't mind, like I would like to ask Pietro, so what do you think transpired that because of the Karabakh war and Russia's abandonment?
Well,
may I just for 1 second? Just 1 second for our viewers to frame this. The whole issue about Pashinyan, the prime minister of Armenia, is that he basically gave up Nagorno-Karabakh, which was for 20 years secured by the Armenian army, but lost the war. And he basically gave it up also in his speech acts, to the point where Vladimir Putin said, "What should I do?" He already gave it away. So Azerbaijan created a de facto state of affairs, and 100,000 people left in Nagorno-Karabakh.
Over 100,000 people.
Over 100,000
of 120,000 people left. And you have to think, Pascal, the magnitude of that situation, because those Armenians had been there from the beginning of time almost. I mean, they had their own distinctive dialect, which even in relation to standard Eastern Armenian was kind of difficult to understand, what they call the Artsakhi dialect or the Karabakh Armenian dialect. But I think about also, so not only is the unique Karabakh Armenian heritage under threat, because now these people are living in exile, but also think about all those cultural monuments from the Middle Ages, from deep in the history. I mean, even we're talking about going back, to like the 4th century. I mean, it's the first church where Mesrop Mashtots, the inventor of the Armenian alphabet, taught his sacred script, actually in Amaras. This is in Nagorno-Karabakh. So, and now this heritage is under severe threat. But this kind of goes to the point that Pashinyan, in his desperation to go west, he betrayed the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. And currently he's betraying the people of Armenia, actually, as a matter of fact.
So can you explain the motivation that you see behind this? So why would a national leader actually give up this? Because nation states have a very poor track record of giving up claims over territory, and he gave it up within overnight.
I think Pascal, he's working for somebody else. There's no other explanation I can give for it. I think that he's under the influence of certain forces who want Armenia to basically kind of weaken itself in order to weaken Russia, in order really to weaken also Iran and to weaken, the security infrastructure of the region. That's what I believe, because there's no other rational explanation for this. Why would you give up your own compatriots? Why would you give up their security? Why would you betray them?
How does it weaken Russia that Armenia basically gives up the claim on Nagorno-Karabakh? How does that have a negative effect on Russia?
Because what happens is the weaker Armenia becomes in the Caucasus, and especially, first of all, with the loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, but not only, but the weaker Armenia becomes, and the weaker, then the position of influence of Russia in Iran also begins to weaken. And the position of Turkey and the position of NATO begins to strengthen. And that's what we're seeing, that NATO and Turkey are on the rise. Also, Israel has its hand in the cookie jar because they want to, kind of use Azerbaijan against Iran, right? They want to, support Azerbaijani irredentism against northern Iran with the so-called Southern Azerbaijan movement, really to kind of claim Tabriz as part of Azerbaijan and this sort of a thing. So there are all these kind of actors there. But the idea is that if Armenia is weakened, then basically Russia and Iran, their influence will be weakened because Turkey's hand will become stronger, right? And that's why most Armenians, actually most of the society, doesn't like Pashinyan. His numbers, his poll numbers now are at historic lows. So to kind of put it in perspective, and this is something Lasha can really identify with, Armenia right now is in the same position that Georgia was in the years following the 2008 war, where Saakashvili was still in power, right? He was blowing up, Soviet monuments in Georgia. He was trying to kind of create a new city on the border with Abkhazia. All this, kind of wild ideas. And then eventually, Bidzina Ivanishvili. I mean, it didn't look like the Georgian opposition was going to be able to coalesce. And then finally, it was October 2011, I believe, where Ivanishvili put his hat in the ring and he forged the Georgian Dream coalition, which at the time it was a real coalition because you had everyone from, Alesanya, who was very pro-NATO, to, Georgian Orthodox
I
nationalists
think
in
they
this
all
kind of
wanted
coalition. Yeah.
they all wanted to get away from the UNM. So whoever
Yeah.
could, they basically decided to carve out their political space under Ivanishvili's camp. But then they eventually sort of were let go and dissipated. But then now he's got this core, a very firm core, by the way, in the shape and form of the GD, that he's managed to basically keep that balance on the foreign policy front.
And actually, not only that, more importantly, he's been able to grow that core because
Sure.
before they had that core and they were relying on people like, like I said, Alesanya, Kidasheli, these kind of people. And now suddenly, you have, Kobakidze, you have Garibashvili, you have these guys, have this kind of core that is becoming stronger and stronger, actually. And the majority of Georgians understand that this is the only way to go, to pursue a pro-Georgian policy, not to be pro-West or pro-East, but pro-you. That's the ultimate thing.
So we have this situation where in the Southern Caucasus, as in many places on the Eurasian landmass, in most places we have a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious communities who live on relatively small plots of land next to each other. The conflicts that we're still seeing, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Nagorno-Karabakh, within Georgia, with Abkhazia and Ossetia, were those conflicts that were less pronounced under Soviet times? Did the actual fact of sovereign statehood make this more intense, or was this thing always there? We just don't read about it in the textbooks very much.
Well, the standard story is, the standard story is that sort of the delineation of borders under the Soviet Union, sort of Stalin's, regional policy, foreign policy, if you will, is started to play out after the Soviet Union collapsed, with all the separatist regions sort of erupting and turning into these flashpoints. But like Pietro pointed out, we've lived with Abkhazians and South Ossetians for hundreds of years. They're part of the Georgian proper territory. Culturally, we're very much have been always been on the same page and close. And but this is specifically, I would say, politically motivated. Politically motivated separatist movements that started in the late 80s to in the beginning of the really started to erupt in the beginning of the 90s. And then, Georgian nationalism under Gamsahurdia did not help, of course. Things could have been handled better. Combination of sort of failure in diplomacy, failure to communicate, if you will, and then Russia's hand in it, I think it's undeniable. But most importantly, like in terms of Georgia's and regional relations with the West, I think Russia, since day one, was afraid that these regions were going to be used to further weaken what came up after the Soviet Union collapsed, meaning sort of the Russian Federation. I think the war in Chechnya also has a connection with that. Putin didn't just want to, Yeltsin, Putin. We all remember, first of all, this argument that Russia is weaker now because it's occupied with with Ukraine or that Central Asian republics. Yeah, sure. Relatively speaking, Central Asian republics are doing fine, much better. That era of Soviet era of subjugation is over. But make no mistake, Russia will come back if it has to. Just like with, somebody was saying, oh, there goes Armenia. Now Armenia is going to be sort of plucked out by the West. This is sort of the same rhetoric that we are seeing because Russia is too distracted in Ukraine, and it was a foolish war, and Russia's regional sort of power plays have been narrowed. The options. Nothing could be further from the truth. Russia is much more powerful now. If I always go back to the brutal Chechenian wars in the 90s, Russia managed to subjugate this region even when it was down and out, or so did the West think. And even with some of the geoeconomic projects that Shevardnadze managed to very shrewdly sort of implement with Azerbaijan, Russia acquiesced to TBC and to all those pivotal key connectivity pipelines, but that didn't really destroy Russia. They didn't really, turn Russia into some sort of a second-tier power in the region. Russia is what Russia has always been. It will go to great lengths to make sure that no security structure or bloc enters this soft underbelly, if you will, South Caucasus, and then from, Barents Sea all the way down to the South Black Sea, that not a single Western sort of military alliance, historically speaking, enters the fray or comes closer to the Russian border. Ukraine is a classic example of that. And so, I think, the argument or sort of painting the picture that Russia is, this is foolish. You cannot, I hope Pashinyan is not succumbing to this myth. He's too smart for that. This is just something to show, they're still in the CSTO, correct?
No, they are still in the CSTO.
Yeah,
One thing I want to say, I just want to kind of add on about this, is that the Caucasus region is intrinsically linked with Russia's security architecture. I mean, firstly, you have to think
whether we like it or not. Yeah,
whether we like it or not, because well, first of all, look, what is Russia mostly? It's mostly flat land. It's mostly steppe. So to have a firmly delineated boundary into your south in this mountainous region, it's very useful for you, right? And when Russia first came into the Caucasus, in a serious way, we can say in 1801 with the annexation of eastern Georgia, Kartli-Kakheti. Once they were able to get that possession, and they had the single road, the Georgian military highway, that connected it with Kartli-Kakheti. The main thing then became, how do we secure this possession? So it actually put Russia in this position where they were almost like, especially when we look at people like Tsitsianov, who himself was Georgian, the idea was almost like the gathering of the Georgian lands under Russian rule. So actually, in some ways, this actually facilitated really also the unification of Georgia in some respects. And that's actually another point I wanted to kind of add, that actually in the Soviet Union, and a lot of people don't understand this in the West, that actually the Soviet Union in some ways succeeded in consolidating these countries more than they were. Like Georgia, I mean, especially
inadvertently, right?
Especially when Georgia first came into the Russian Empire, there you had Principality of Mingrelia, you had Goria, you had these different entities. Ajaria was part of the Ottoman Empire. Like I said, there's Kartli-Kakheti, and even before then there was Kartli and Kakheti. They had to unite. So the whole thing was such a patchwork. And even with Armenians, that you had like the Malikdom of Sunik, the Malikdom of Artsakh or Hamsa, everything was so fragmented. And really Russia kind of allowed for these countries, first of all, to kind of consolidate. And we see that with the Soviet rule too, or the Soviet administration. But also we can look at the fact that for Armenians and Georgians, it was also quite important because it reconnected Armenia and Georgia really to Europe. Because Armenia and Georgia were countries that were between Southern Europe and the Near East throughout their whole history. I mean, this is a fact of geography, right? I mean, you see on one side, historically, you had the Greco-Roman world and you had Persia. Yes. And then so, but over time, that connection with, the Greco-Roman world was more or less lost for Armenia and Georgia. But Russia connected Armenia and Georgia closer in many ways to Europe. So like when we look at, for example, the First Georgian Republic of 1918, you look at like Nojordania and actually Philip Makradze, they got their education, so to speak, in Warsaw, in Poland. And Poland at the time was part of the Russian Empire. So because Russia has had this connection with Europe, it allowed Georgians and Armenians, especially like when we look at the 19th century, with the rise of national movements, national ideologies, also socialism, liberalism, these different ideas coming in, Enlightenment ideas, that in many respects, Russia provided the window to Europe for Armenians and Georgians. So
Even
that's kind of
before
like,
that,
yeah.
you could argue even before that, Georgia, sort of in idealistic terms, sort of metaphysical terms, if you will, always wanted to become, even from the ancient Greek times, sort of part of the West, and there were.
Yeah.
But just quickly here, I just wanted to say, to what I mean, Georgia was always basically looked at by the Russian Empire as what? As a geopolitical space against, say, the Ottoman Empire. Against, I mean, Orlando Figes has an excellent book on the Crimean War, and he alludes to this, right, where this entire space was always used between the East and the West. Lord Palmerston's whole idea of sort of coming, he wouldn't even call us Georgians. He would say the Caucasian peoples, right, from Azerbaijan to Armenia to Georgia. So he was looking at this space as a platform, as a springboard to weaken, destruct Russia. And in the early 20s, say Russo-Japanese War, 1905, for example. You remember, we all know Dashnaks, Georgians, nationalists, and Azerbaijani nationalists were fighting against Russian Empire, aligning with Japan, with far away Japan. Now, Japan had its own sort of calculations, but it's funny how it repeats. Its history kind of repeats itself, using the South Caucasus, using these three republics to achieve, because Russia suffered enormously after the loss with Japan and its prestige. So they wanted to sort of finish it off. And it was Japan in combination with Western powers, again, using this geopolitical space. And one wonders, what was Georgia doing aligning with Japan? But then there were these sort of clandestine military relations. I can't recall all the Japanese generals and sort of the then or Japanese version of the CIA, officers that were working with Georgians and Armenians and Azerbaijanis to overthrow the Tsar. And yet somehow Akhrana would always sort of break the code and basically reveal these conspiracies against the Tsarist Empire. So you see, I wouldn't go to that extent, but the patterns of what's happening today and how the South Caucasus is basically still looked at as a region, basically to maintain some sort of a perpetual, resistance or revolution, if you will, Russia, is still being utilized.
And it's also utilized, especially, because there's also especially this connection or this association of resistance against Russia with the North Caucasus, with the Islamic peoples, right? They go back to we go back to the history of
go back to Chechnya.
Back to Chechnya, and it's actually in the West, it's like romanticized. It's even orientalized. We can say that the noble savage against the fiendish Russia, so to speak, or the expansionist Russia. But in truth, they were using these peoples. They wanted to use these peoples against Russia. It had nothing to do with any kind of genuine, feeling for support of North Caucasians or Armenians or Georgians or Azerbaijanis. The idea was to use these peoples and use this region against Russia, unfortunately. So absolutely. When we look at that history, and also
you can see why Russia pays so much attention to this entire region. It's
and also the geographical aspect, because even when we look at the whole history of Russia and Turkey clashing over, basically Turkish Armenia in the 19th century, because there were multiple wars fought over this. You could also read that as kind of a way, again, of Russia trying to secure its Caucasian possessions, and the central one being, of course, Tbilisi, Tiflis, where basically the idea was to kind of strengthen the security of Georgia and strengthen the security of Caucasia by basically kind of, strengthening its position in Turkish Armenia effectively. Because again, that's one plateau. It's the Armenian plateau. It's a natural barrier. And even like, again, going back deep into the history, Queen Tamar understood this because she was the one who put the Shakarians on the throne. I mean, she backed the restoration of kind of this Bagratuni Armenia on the Armenian highland, and that was again to kind of help bolster Georgia's security, vis-a-vis, its own security problems. So yeah.
In this sense, like the three Southern Caucasus nations have it extremely difficult because the neighbors of the three are the three big ones, right? You've got Turkey, you've got Iran, you've got Russia, and all of them are suspicious of each other, to say the least.
Well, I would kind of push back a little bit on Russia and Iran because Russia and Iran seem to have come, as we know, to an understanding, right? There's much more of a dialogue between Russia and Iran now. We especially see with this treaty that was inked in January between President Pezeshkian and President Putin, right? It's a symbol of where Russian-Iranian relations have gone, how they've evolved, versus what used to be there before. I mean, we had, again, going back deep into the history, the Russo-Persian Wars, which were fought again over these same places, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, or the Republic of Azerbaijan versus, again, northern Iran, Iranian Azerbaijan. But this whole history that Russia and Iran have, faced with each other, now, they're coming more and more and more to an understanding. There's more trust. Even it's to such a point that when you look at the treaty, Russia makes a very strong, basically places, I should say, a very strong emphasis on the idea that we will not support separatist movements on your territory, Iran. And it's almost like a way of acknowledging, what, we wronged you in the past, by supporting, let's say, an Azerbaijani republic in 1946 in your, in your northern provinces, or, Kurdish Mahabad Republic. And now, we will, we understand where your sensitive points are, and we are going to kind of work with you and accommodate you, and we will also defend, your territorial integrity too. And the same thing, Iran has that similar obligation with Russia, because again, as I referenced earlier on another interview, you look at what Kaya Kalas is saying. Let's break up Russia. Let's break them up into different, republics, right? And which is really a ridiculous idea. And talk about a catastrophe for Eurasian security. But that idea is still, it's very reassuring for Russia to receive from Iran this idea that we're going to support you on your territorial integrity as well, against this kind of maybe Western effort to balkanize your country. As for Turkey, it pursues its own interests, but it also is a member of NATO. So its ability to be truly free in terms of determining its kind of foreign policy path is somewhat questionable. I mean, because you also see oftentimes it's allied with NATO interests. Its interests often rhyme with those of NATO. So Turkey is a force that you can't really trust, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Artsakh, as we've seen over and over again. Turkey, unfortunately, has not been terribly reliable. I mean, from the Russian point of view, you can use Turkey opportunistically for your own ends. But
with this balancing act, I think, do you think Erdogan has done well?
I think he's done well. I think that, he would do better to be more, to take into account more, let's say, Russian and Iranian interests. I think that, unfortunately, again, as I've said on this podcast, Erdogan, speaking from the Russian point of view, Erdogan, if you're smart, you'll work with us, right? You'll see where the world is going. It's going toward a multipolar world. Why would you pay lip service to Zelensky, right? Or maybe help out Ukraine in certain kind of underhanded ways, or maybe undermine, Syria's sovereignty.
But isn't that the amazing thing about Turkey? It does that. It applied for partnership status in BRICS, and actually Russia helped it to get that last year. And in a sense, Turkey plays in both camps, and it opportunistically uses whichever hand it feels is the better one, which is not a nice thing to do. It's not a reliable thing to do, but it it performs for Turkey, doesn't it?
It does. And actually, you can say that in that respect, Turkey pursues its national interests much better than Pashinyan in Armenia, because Pashinyan is overtly, again, going against the national interests. And and it's not like people in Armenia don't see that or don't understand that. They understand that there's opposition to this, but it has not yet coalesced into a unified movement, right? Again, like I say, it's just like where Georgia was, in the last years of Saakashvili's reign, as it were, just
And I
before Bidzina came
think
in.
the region, independently of Western interference, is figuring itself out. Let me just ask you, ask a question to Petra real quick. The Shusha agreement and this whole Turkic world connection, where do you think that's going to take Turkey, Azerbaijan? There is an Israeli connection there, but I think it's slightly different. But mostly sort of Central Asia, Turkey, Azerbaijan. Um,
I think Turkey has these aspirations. It wants to be a pan-Turkic power. It wants to exercise its influence. It wants to, kind of get into Central Asia. Of course, that also rhymes with Western interests too. When we see like this idea of a Trans-Caspian gas pipeline to Turkmenistan, at least this is proposed. This is what they want. They want to get into Central Asia. You see that with Turkish NGO activity in Central Asia. But at the same time, I think Turkey's ability really to influence in Central Asia is somewhat limited because the governments of Central Asia, of these countries, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, they're much more balanced than, let's say, Baku. They understand that we have to work with Russia and Iran. Actually, we like our relations with Russia. We don't want to rock the boat. We're also in between Russia and China, so China is very important for us. We can't very well break from these countries. And we are not the kind of countries who are like, rah rah rah, like, hyper nationalistic, especially when you look at a country like, for instance, Uzbekistan, which is very multi-ethnic. And so I think at the end of the day, this strategy will only go so far for this idea of, kind of creating this kind of pan-Turanic or pan-Turkic belt. Plus also Russia and Iran, as we see with their agreement, have made it very clear that they will not tolerate, these kind of ideas. And especially when we look at the Iranian position on Sunik, Zangezur, this region in southern Armenia, and also, Russia's position too is basically the same as Iran's, although they're less vocal about it. But they've made it very clear we're not going to allow, Azerbaijan to kind of just like snatch up this region. So yes, Turkey has that aspiration, but I think it will find that it is, yeah, it will find that it is limited in its ability to do that. And plus, also you have to think for Turkey itself, they're overstretched. So yes, they have the aspiration to go all the way to Central Asia, but look, they've just fragmented a state to their south, and now they have to put Syria back together again. That's their problem now. That's their issue now, all of a sudden. In addition, they're still recovering from the earthquake. In addition, they have, like I said earlier on this podcast, so 25 to 30% of their population is Kurdish. So they have big problems. It's not, and they have, economic problems. It's not like as if everything is perfect for Turkey. So the idea that, and actually it's really crazy because if you think that if they have this vision to kind of carve out an empire in post-Soviet Central Asia, amid all the other problems that they have, that's a classical case of misplaced priorities. It really is. I mean, I mean, if you're
I
Turkey,
think it's
you
more
think about,
rhetoric than pragmatic politics. I think Erdogan understands that quite well, and obviously, sort of Russia, Turkey will constantly balance each against each other. So, um, Pascal,
I want to ask you a question, but it's kind of unfair because I want to ask you about Azerbaijan, but we don't have a colleague actually from Azerbaijan also to chime in. But am I correct in my gut feeling that the wild card of the three Caucasus nations is Azerbaijan? Because on the one hand, it also seems to have larger territorial aspirations. On the one hand, maybe on the costs to the detriment of Armenia. On the other hand, as you said, the even in Iran, there are some claims that
not
Azerbaijan
only
has, and
Iran,
and
not
those
only,
can be fueled.
yeah, not only Iran and Armenia. I mean, they claim Azerbaijan's claims are such, and we're talking about, by the way. So yes, when you look at the three Caucasian countries, we can see, you have kind of irredentism that emerges from certain sectors of the society, right? You see some people in Georgia who, they look back at the map of Queen Tamar's Georgia, the greater Georgia, Armenians look at like Tigran the Great, or they look at, Western Armenia and this kind of thing. But these these are not articulated as being official claims on territories of neighboring states. The big difference with Azerbaijan is they're actually doing claims on neighboring states. So they claim, Aliyev talks about Western Azerbaijan. He's talking about really the whole Republic of Armenia, which would be, in his view, what his vision would be, which would be the whole Republic of Armenia denuded of Armenians, and also the claim to the entire northern Iran, which would be called the Southern Azerbaijan. That's what they call Southern Azerbaijan. And even now you hear most recently in the Azerbaijani media claims to parts of southern Dagestan, the city of Derbent, as northern Azerbaijan, right? So that's why it's really the wild card, because Armenia and Georgia don't have these kind of irredentist designs on neighboring states. Even when we look at the case of Nagorno-Karabakh, it was all about the Karabakh Armenians' self-determination that Armenia was supporting. Armenia was not in this conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh or supportive of the Karabakh Armenians to take territory from Azerbaijan. This what we're seeing from Baku now is, this is like, it's almost like something we would see from, like, let's say, Imperial Japan. That we want this territory, we want that territory, and we have a big military, and so who's going to stop us? So we should just roll in and take whatever we want. That's what I think when we talk about the wild card. That really is the wild card at the end of the day.
Lasha, how do you interpret your eastern neighbor?
Well, Georgia's regional politics have always been, no war with neighbors, neutrality. Basically, Georgia's conflict, Georgia's troubles have always been within the Georgian proper, South Ossetia, Abkhazia. Unfortunately, what Pietro just alluded to, where some of the mistakes that happened within Georgia was sort of, the improvements on those mistakes is that now creating sort of a sovereign Abkhazia or sovereign South Ossetia within the Georgian territory, within the Georgian proper. I think that would be the way to go in terms of minimizing chances for, or maximizing chances for any future negotiations. And I think Pietro also, in terms of Nagorno-Karabakh, I think you alluded that, correct? If I'm not mistaken, that sort of allowing some sort of autonomous status. But I think there must be a realization that these separatist conflicts, can be stoked at any time. Russia is always there. But the only way to mitigate or to balance against it is figuring out internally how you want to handle separatist movements, within the Georgian proper, and figure out how to, instead of sort of this irredentist nationalist approach, figure out a way how to reincorporate them both socio-psychologically as well as geopolitically, and work with them. Because I think at the end of the day, this is foolish. I don't think this is an ethnic conflict. This is no hatred that we've seen in other parts of the world, of one nation against another. An ethnic minority or against another. This is I believe strongly that very much politically motivated and can be resolved politically. Except with Azerbaijan-Armenia case, it was resolved by hard power.
But I also want to add something else too, which is that
Georgia is in no position to do that with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and even if it did, I would.
But one thing I want to just say about all this is that when we talk about these conflicts, Nagorno-Karabakh, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, we also have to look at the agency of the people who live there. Because if they feel they're being discriminated against, or they feel like the central government is being chauvinistic toward us, you're going to have problems. So that's why the approach, especially when we look at Ivanishvili, to have a dialogue with these people, especially in the case of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, it's incredibly important. To understand you have agency, that we don't just see you as Russian agents, that we need you. We understand that you have some concerns. You
Extremely
serious, or
important. Yeah.
to put it lightly, and that we need to we should have a dialogue on that. In the case of Azerbaijan, unfortunately, this policy wasn't pursued. Now, the big issue there is that Armenians and Azerbaijanis, as people, really, and I can tell you from experience, they definitely can get along. Their cultures are very close.
That's
And
right.
there's no there really as on a person to person level, there's no real problems between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. They can talk quite normally and interact normally with each other. The biggest problem is when you have a government like in Baku with Aliyev, where he's constantly promoting the hatred against the Armenians in his society to make the people, hate Armenians, and even got to a point where there was a young woman who was in kind of this dialogue forum with Armenians. She was Azerbaijani, and she was saying how, in Azerbaijan, because of the propaganda, we were hating so much that I even began to dislike myself. I was hating Armenians so much, I even began to dislike myself. So that kind of hatred, that the level of the ethnic hatred that Aliyev is promoting against the Armenians, it's really, really dangerous and destabilizing for the region. It's no way to go. So right now, we can say that from their point of view, they think that hard power has solved the problem. But in the longer term, I don't think that the use of hard power or the sponsorship of kind of chauvinistic nationalism is a solution to any of these issues in the region. Because again, they have to be dealt with very sensitively. And Bidzina understands this in Georgia,
Yes,
that you can't take this, Gamsakhurdia, line of Georgia for Georgians and da da da. It never ends well. And also even for Georgia, not aside from even Abkhazia and South Ossetia, even look at the civil war in Georgia in the 90s. I mean, Georgia has had a painful history in the post-Soviet era. And so
definitely so.
you have to be very sensitive in general when you deal with these issues. You can't be promoting the territorial irredentism against your neighbors. You can't be promoting ethnic chauvinism. You have to find ways to live with your neighbors. You have to say, Armenians and Azerbaijanis, we've been here together, for centuries, and we can certainly get along. But the problem is that dialogue between the societies, which is so necessary for peace, is disrupted when you have a government that is constantly saying, we want to wipe you out, we want to kick you out, that you people are terrible, that kind of a thing. When you're talking about the people, that you people are, monsters or whatever, then it's a problem. When you have Aliyev, what he does is he goes to, for instance, Nakhichevan, which is an exclave. It's on the border with Iran, and he sends the army there with sledgehammers to wipe out a medieval Armenian cemetery, to basically take sledgehammers and turn these medieval monuments, these khachkars, these Armenian stone crosses, to dust. Right? It reminds me of the quote of Heine, where they burn books, they will also eventually burn people. And by the way, there was an Azerbaijani author who actually was trying to call for peace with Armenians, and his books were burned in Baku. So this kind of level of ethnic hatred I mean, it's not even, I mean, something that's artificially promoted by this government, for political reasons. But it's not going to be it's not going to be in any way it's not going to be in any way a stabilizing force for the region. It's only going to promote instability and only going to promote more problems for everybody, I think.
We are nearing the 1 hour mark, and I would like to ask uh, each one of you 1 minute. What are the next events on the calendar or developments that you're looking out for that will have an impact on the region? Maybe this time Lasha first, and then Pietro for the last word.
Well, it's always hard to predict these things, but I would say that Georgia, I would just say that continuation of more of the same, what Georgia has been doing in terms of regional politics. Stability is extremely important. I think Georgia will have to maintain its dual position. Its pro-Western course is in its constitution. It cannot just deviate from that. But it has to prioritize security. It will have to prioritize geoeconomic projects, money making, basically, and it has to survive against Russia. It has to be it has to take care of its own, vulnerabilities. The politics as before is just not sustainable for Georgia. You got to find a common ground with Moscow, as much as a lot of people hate that possibility, because that's the only option to survive as a state. If anybody thinks that Russia won't reinvade Georgia or won't use the already existing troops that it has there to completely just divide up that country, they're deadly wrong. And underestimating what Pashinyan, I think, is doing. I hope he's not, but that all of a sudden now Russia, the West is going to coming to its rescue. That's another sort of patterns of return or setting up yet another trap. And I think Armenian people and Pashinyan are too smart to sort of buy into that. But geopolitically speaking, again, that would be a suicide. If anybody thinks that Russia will hesitate to invade or to stop that process, by using its military, just because it's occupied in Ukraine, not to mention the fact that it's already won in Ukraine, and then with Trump now they're basically dividing up the world. It seems like even the European Union is not at the negotiating table. So for the region, I think for Georgia, I would encourage them to continue the policy of stability and pragmatism towards Russia while maintaining, sort of philosophically, if you will, and the long-term perspective, their pro-Western course. And I think that dual policy is quite possible without choosing one or the other or destroying yourself in the process.
Pietro, what do you think will be the most impactful issues to come up or to appear on the calendar that might impact the region in the next months and years?
Well, I think the big issue, I mean, especially if we look at Armenia, is the 2026 elections in Armenia, where basically it's going to be a referendum on Pashinyan. And also you have to think that now that we see major, geopolitical shifts going on between Moscow and Washington. And we also see kind of, like I say, the Eurocrats are kind of left in the lurch. And also the NGO aid is disappearing. We see, especially with USAID and all these organizations, now you see kind of what I call NGO nicks, in Armenia, basically begging for donations, to support their outlets. That actually this is going to have an impact, certainly, on Pashinyan, and it is already having an impact, I can say. But the other thing is, in general, I would say it's not necessarily, I want to kind of amend slightly something that Lasha said, which is it shouldn't be about necessarily surviving against Russia, but surviving with Russia. Because Russia's going to be your neighbor, Russia's always going to be there. And not only that, we can also say for Armenia and Georgia, culturally, historically, they benefited enormously by being associated with Russia. I mean, just think about not only the connection with Europe, but think about the exposure to the great Russian literature. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Pushkin, all these writers, Lermontov. This is all a legacy of being connected with Russia. The connection between the Georgian and Armenian revolutionary movements and the Russian democratic revolutionary movement in the 19th century. This is all part of this connections, all part of this very interconnected history between, among these countries. So I think that it's not a question of, like, let's say Russia versus the West, lesser of two evils. Actually, it's very beneficial. Plus, also you have to think something like this. When we look at the Soviet times, Armenia and Georgia are small countries, and they get more exposure by being associated with Russia. So look at the Georgian film industry, right? You have this film, Tengiz Abuladze's film Repentance, very, very famous, beautiful Georgian film. And it was marketed in the West as a Russian film, but it got more exposure. People, got to learn more about Georgia. Where is this country? They didn't know anything about it before. And the same we can say with Armenian cinema as well. I mean, that actually Armenian and Georgian cinema, they were propelled to international fame through the influence of the USSR. And so there's just so much positive connection there with Russia. Russia actually amplifies these countries. It enhances these countries, right? And frankly, Armenia and Georgia enhance them. If you go to St. Petersburg and you go around the city, you'll see Georgian restaurants everywhere. St. Petersburg would not be the same without all these wonderful Georgian restaurants, without also Armenian restaurants. Yeah.
I wish all the cultural and soft power could just resolve all our problems. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I think Pietro will agree with me that, I think balancing, going back to geopolitics, going back to realpolitik is the way to save yourself. But if Khinkali were to create peace between Russia and Georgia, which we would be best of friends. And while culturally speaking, of course, just like with Armenia or Azerbaijan or Russia, we've all gotten along. I think the ugliness of hard power, and this is where this whole survival as a state, I think, comes in. Because what Georgia has been doing in the early 90s is just been living in this idealistic la la land. And that has been very detrimental for it.
But it is.
And I think, Armenia should learn in general from what happened in Georgia. The Armenian people.
I think so.
And
yes.
actually, frankly, they should have learned. They should. By watching events in Georgia, they should have learned. Already what the best pathway is. So.
Correct.
Now, if before, let's say, Bidzina was taking cues from Serge in Armenia, now Armenians are going to have to be taking cues from Bidzina. And
yes.
this is how it works.
But that's what we do.
This is the Caucasian chalk circle, we can say.
But that's also a classic for the whole Eurasian continent. The Swiss and the Austrians constantly take cues from each other. The Swiss were neutralized in Vienna, and then in 150 years later, the Austrians said, "Okay, we're gonna do a neutrality like Switzerland." We are constantly playing ideas and concepts from one to another. So the best thing we can do is learn from our neighbors and then adapt it to our situations.
Seems to me that the only it's the collective West that has failed to learn from what sort of the geopolitics of South Caucasus and surrounding areas around the Eurasian heartland can offer. But we'll see. Time will tell.
And also a lack of sensitivity toward the history, toward the traditions, toward the culture. This is also very plainly seen. We look at von der Leyen or Borrell or any of these people, their attitude toward, the traditional culture of Armenia and Georgia, the place of the Armenian church, the Georgian church. There's just like an insensitivity to this past, absolutely.
Okay, more sensitivity and more humanity in order to learn how to navigate this.
And more dialogue, absolutely. Like absolutely. I said, it's not impossible for let's say Armenians and Georgians, certainly Armenians and Georgians are actually, their relations are pretty good right now. But, let's say between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, dialogue between Armenians and Azerbaijanis, certainly this is the best way to go. Dialogue is the best option.
And I love dialogue, which is why we will do this again. And I would like to thank you, my colleagues, Lasha Kasradze in the US and Pietro Shakarian in Russia. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure talking to you both. It was nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Merci shat. Didi madloba.
Didi madloba. Merci shat. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.